Hey guys, welcome back to my channel for another midweek mystery. Although this week's video is something a little bit different. It's something which is just going to make you think a little bit, and honestly I was inspired to do this particular case after doing the Bethany Decker case last week, where so many of you were shocked that she went 21 days before anyone realised she was missing. Well, today I've got a woman who was dead for over 2 years before anybody even discovered her body. Joyce Carol Vincent was born on the 19th of October 1965 in Hammersmith, London. She likely died sometime around December 2003 when she was aged 38, but she went undiscovered for more than 2 years. Like I said, Joyce was born in Hammersmith, London to her parents, who had actually recently emigrated to London from Grenada. Joyce had 4 older sisters, and her sisters were actually born in Grenada, and Joyce was the first of them to actually be born in London. And Joyce's childhood wasn't exactly the easiest. Joyce's mother actually died when Joyce was just 11 years old after a routine operation went wrong. And apparently her father just wasn't really that great at raising the children. Apparently he was more interested in trying to hit on other women than he was in actually caring for his daughters. And so Joyce was pretty much raised by her 4 older sisters. They were her parents. Their father would eventually pass away in 2004, so after Joyce herself died. But even before Joyce died, she would tell people that her father was already dead. She told people that he passed away in 2001. Joyce was known to be quite a lively character, but she could also be very quiet and subdued when she wanted to. Her friends remember her as being an effervescent person. She was the life and soul of the party. But how can somebody like this die and nobody notice a thing? Joyce left school at just 16 with 0 qualifications, but she managed to get a job as a secretary in London, and over the years she would work a variety of different jobs, slowly building her way up through the corporate ladder. She ended up in the Treasury Department at Ernst & Young, where she worked for 4 years, and it was a very well paid position, so Joyce was doing very good for herself. But then one day in March 2001, she just quits out of the blue. She tells a load of people different stories. She tells some people that she's been headhunted for this different company. She tells others that she's going travelling around Asia. And then she just kind of disappears. All we know is that shortly after Joyce left her job, she actually went to work at a shelter for victims of domestic violence in Haringey, London. Strangely, we know virtually nothing as to what happened to Joyce to make her end up in this place. This lively, effervescent young woman who was doing really well for herself suddenly ends up in a domestic victim shelter, and nobody knew that anything was going wrong in her life. It doesn't even seem like anybody knew of a relationship or who she was with at the time. There are rumours that she was engaged to someone. I mean, it seems very likely that she was in a pretty serious relationship if this is where she ended up. But we just have no idea who this person was, where they ended up, how Joyce ended up where she was. How can people know so little about their friend and family's life? Whilst at the domestic abuse centre, she actually gets a very low paid job as a cleaner in a budget hotel, which is a huge step away from somebody who was in a high flying job in corporate London, is now a cleaner in this tiny hotel working for minimum wage. It's around this time that she became estranged from her family. She completely detached herself. Her family said there was never an argument, there was never a cross word spoken. Joyce just kind of started ignoring them, and it got worse from there, and eventually they had no idea where she was. It's been speculated that she was probably very ashamed of the situation she found herself in, ashamed to be a victim of domestic abuse. I mean, that's always something that happens to somebody else. It never actually happens to you. Or maybe she just didn't want to be traced by her abuser. Maybe she just went off the grid so this person who was hurting her couldn't find her anymore. Everyone who ever spoke of knowing Joyce said that this just wasn't the kind of situation that you'd ever picture her ending up in. Everyone thought that she'd end up married with kids, living in a big, beautiful Victorian home with all the latest furniture and all the latest fashion. You'd never picture her to end up where she did. And it's important to note as well that men loved Joyce. She was constantly getting male attention to the point where other females actually tended not to like her because it was always her that got the men's attention. Joyce would never cause any kinds of problems. You could always chat to her about anything. She was bubbly and lively and smiley and chatty, and she just had this thing about her, this thing that some girls have that make men just fall in love. On the flip side, this meant the men got infatuated and they got very heavy with her very quickly, and Joyce would kind of freak out. Like on many occasions her friends said that she would complain about this guy or that guy that was coming on too strong. But then again, when I'm talking about Joyce's friends, I'm not talking about lifelong best friends that she had. Joyce would very much flit through friendship groups. Most of her friends were the friends of the guy that she would be dating at the time. Nobody really knew of any strong friendships she had just off her own back. It was always her boyfriend's friends or her roommates or this person knew her through a mutual friend. Joyce was seen as somebody who was fiercely independent, and so nobody ever really questioned the fact that it never seemed like she had any friends. She didn't seem like the type to crave these female friendships that so many people want. She seemed quite happy just going through life with herself. After leaving the domestic abuse shelter, Joyce moved into a bedsit flat above the Wood Green shopping centre in North London. The flat was owned by the Metropolitan Housing Trust, and it was a flat that was specifically put aside to house victims of domestic abuse. And later on, when people found out that this is where Joyce ended up, people would express their shock, say like, this just wasn't where you would think this girl would end up. She was doing really well until one day she just quits her job and goes off the grid. Nobody ever would have expected Joyce to end up in a mismatched bedsit flat in North London. And it was also the kind of place where nobody got to know their neighbours. The neighbours wouldn't speak to each other, possibly because this was known to be a flat that would house victims of domestic abuse. It's very possible that people would just steer clear. Around November 2003, Joyce was actually hospitalised for 2 days. She went into hospital as she was vomiting blood, and she ended up getting diagnosed with a peptic ulcer. And a hospital form actually showed that when she had to list her next of kin, she listed her bank manager. After a couple of days in hospital, Joyce returns home and she ends up dying alone in her flat at some time in December 2003. But nobody notices anything. Even when neighbours start to smell the decomposition of Joyce's body, they just assume it's coming from the bins that are downstairs. Joyce's flat was at the end of the block and she only had one neighbour, so nobody would ever necessarily have to walk past her flat to get to where they needed to be. And her neighbour just never really noticed anything. She never spoke to Joyce anyway. As time moves on, people just forget about Joyce Vincent. They just assume that this end flat is unoccupied and everyone just moves on with their life. Even the housing company don't notice. You see, because Joyce was put into the flat by the Metropolitan Housing Trust and she was a victim of domestic abuse, they were paying half of her rent every month. So automatically half of Joyce's rent was being paid every single month, so it didn't flag up immediately. I mean, all of the systems were showing that the rent was getting paid, even if just partially, so it was never flagged up to the authorities that something could have been wrong. She had a lot of money in the bank and her bills were paid by direct debit. So every single month the bills, the water, the electricity would come out of her account and nothing ever flagged up because it was still getting paid. However, over the next couple of years, this unpaid rent did start to accrue up to a sum of £2,400, and obviously it flagged up on the system. Housing officials did try to contact Joyce to get her to pay this rent, but of course all of their letters went unreplied, and so eventually they make the decision to repossess her place. On the 25th of January 2006, bailiffs force entry into Joyce's flat. They notice a huge pile of letters stacked up behind the door and a mountain of washing up. And then they finally discover the 2-year-old corpse of Joyce Vincent. She was lying on her living room floor, surrounded by Christmas presents. They were wrapped, but she never got the opportunity to deliver them to anyone, and it's not known who these presents were for. Who was Joyce wrapping presents for? People who didn't even realise that she'd been dead for 2 years. She was lying in front of the TV, which was still on after all this time, and nobody ever questioned the noise coming from Joyce's flat because the area was quite a lively area. There was always a lot of drug dealers, so even in the middle of the night there's still going to be noise around, so nobody ever questioned it. Even the heating was still on. By the time she was found, her body was described as mostly skeletal by a pathologist, so she was basically just a skeleton, and this meant that she was too decomposed to ever really find a cause of death. But it's thought that she was most likely killed by natural causes, possibly a complication from the peptic ulcer that she had, or maybe even from asthma. She'd suffered with pretty bad asthma ever since she was a child, and she was notoriously bad at managing it. Authorities identified her through her dental records, and they contacted her sisters to let them know what had happened. And the police also wanted to question her sisters about how they didn't notice that she was gone. But her sisters were as shocked as anybody else. They said that they'd been trying to get in contact with her, they'd sent her many letters, but she'd never responded. They actually even hired a private detective to find out where she lived, which is how they got her address. And so they wrote to her many times. All of these letters were found behind her door, but when they didn't get a response, they just assumed that she didn't want to be found and they didn't want to overstep the boundary and just turn up at her flat. So how did all of this happen to Joyce? How did she end up here? Was the isolation her own choice, or did society neglect her? We don't know the story of how she ended up in a domestic violence shelter. We don't know if she was showing the signs of domestic violence beforehand, or if it was just completely out of the blue. Was it her partner that forced this isolation, or was it because of her own shame? I mean, even before this, even before any relationship, any domestic violence, people would comment on the fact that Joyce had no strong personal relationships. But it is a really interesting commentary on how little people actually know their neighbours. I mean, would you notice if your neighbours went missing one day? I don't think I would, probably not for quite a while. We all like to think that if we died people would notice, and maybe that's the case for now. I mean, if I died right now, I know for a fact somebody would realise very, very quickly. But we can't speak for ourselves in 10, 15, 20 years. What's going to happen in our lives in that time that makes everything different? What will my own situation be in 14 years time when I'm 38 years old like Joyce? I just have no idea. Joyce didn't have the typical profile of somebody who would die and be forgotten. She wasn't old without family, she wasn't particularly a loner, she wasn't a drug addict, or she wasn't an alcoholic. She was this bubbly, lively girl, and things just went wrong for her. Who Joyce actually was and the circumstances of her death are probably always going to be a mystery. We're never going to have any real answers as to what exactly happened to her. I thought this case would just be interesting to cover this week, to give you guys a little bit of context, a story as to how people can be forgotten, how people can just disappear and nobody realise. So I know this week's story has been a little bit different, but I hope you found it educational regardless. Make sure you give this video a thumbs up and leave your comments down below, subscribe to my channel, and I'll see you in the next one. Bye guys, and I'm so sorry for all the noise outside. I can't help it, it won't go away.